I'm Leanne Pittsford. I'm the founder and CEO of Lesbians Who Tech. How many of you have heard of Lesbians Who Tech? Okay, that's good. To my left, Danielle Moody Mills, CEO of Politini Media. She's also an amazing contributor for NBC News. Sarah Kate, she's the CEO of GLAD. How many of you have heard of GLAD? Okay, just kidding. And then we have Andy, who is very involved with New York Tech Meetup and New York Tech Alliance, and local. It's good local energy, as well as the Queer Tech Meetup here. So real briefly, I'd love for you all to give a little more intro on your background really quick before we start the conversation.
Okay, thank you, Leanne. Thank you, folks, for moving in closer so that we can see all your fabulous faces. I'm Danielle Moody Mills, CEO of Politini Media, which is a boutique communications firm that works at the intersection of politics and pop culture, and working to rebrand and share values and mission of the new American majority, or the rising American electorate. Essentially, everyone who is not white, old, straight, and a man. So I do that work, and I'm also a writer with NBCnews.com for their BLK vertical, which is about social justice, racism, and issues that are affecting the Black community. My role here, talking about LGBTQ bias, is really a personal one. The politics became personal to me back in 2009 when my now wife and I were engaged, and realized that at that time there were only a handful of places that you could get married in the United States. And so we decided to get off of our couch instead of writing checks for the movement and become actual spokespeople for the LGBTQ movement. And so now I'm at a space where I recognize that we need to have more conversations that span what it means to feel like you're an other, right? And what happens when you're in those spaces where people deem you as less than. So that's a lot of the work that I do.
Great. Thank you, Leanne. And my name is Sarah Kate Ellis. I'm the president and CEO of GLAD. GLAD is the National LGBTQ Media Advocacy Organization. We're about 30 years old. We got our start during the AIDS crisis in 1985, when the reporting that was coming out was really anti-gay, and it was painting gay men as villains, and it was terrible. And so the first meeting was actually a gathering in front of the New York Post to protest the coverage. Since then, we've moved into Hollywood. We've had a big footprint in Hollywood, and we've worked very closely to make sure that there's LGBTQ representation in TV shows and movies and, of course, streaming content. I've been at GLAD for about 2.5 years. Before that, I was on the corporate side of the world, and I was at Time Inc., and I ran about 13 magazines and digital properties. So being in the not-for-profit side of the world is new for me, but having a mission with purpose has been pretty phenomenal. So I'm excited to talk to you guys about the topic at hand. We were down in Orlando on the ground, so I'll share some of that with you as well, and what we're doing moving forward.
Thank you, Leanne. My name is Andy Saldana. I'm the Director of Operations for New York Tech Alliance, formerly New York Tech Meetup. And my day-to-day is really getting out into the community and advocating on all parts of the technology community, from the entrepreneurs and startups to people who are looking for access into the larger tech community, and making sure that the avenues are there to connect all of the players and resources available. When I started 3.5 years ago, I was fairly new to New York, fairly new to the startup scene and the tech community, and I was not seeing myself represented in any way, shape, or form in the bigger tech ecosystem. And so I started going to these smaller meetup groups, the Latinos in Tech, NYC Tech Latinas, Minorities in Tech, and looking for basically my people. And one of the events that I went to was an Out in Tech event, and I still didn't quite feel like it represented who I was as a gay man of color. in the tech community. So a friend of mine asked me, like, hey, there's this meetup group. It's kind of defunct, hasn't done any events in a long time. It's called Gay Tech Meetup. Would you want to help organize? And I'm like, sure, I'll help you out, see what's going on. I figured I'd run 1 or 2 meetings, realize that there's so much overlap with the other groups, and just continue it. Like, give them the list and move on. I got so many people asking about it and attending each event. There was over 150 people for just a networking mixer and just a simple panel on navigating the tech space as a queer man. And I was just like, what is going on here? So realized that there was something there and a piece missing that really focused on total inclusion of the queer community. Whether you're a white gay male or a black woman or a transgendered Latina, we kind of opened up the meetup group to kind of encompass all of that and make it as comfortable as possible. And so in my day-to-day, I bring my whole self with me, no matter who I'm talking to, and let them know everything I'm doing. And I am super happy to say that I also run a startup company with my fiance, who is a gay white man. So it's like I have an LGBT-owned startup company.
Woo! I want to sort of start off with, more focused around Orlando. I think that was a really emotional moment for the LGBTQ community in a way that was just a really sort of new and powerful feeling around intersectionality. And obviously, most of us found out about it in the morning. And so I just wanted to kind of start on more of an emotional level. Waking up that morning, how did you sort of feel about the state of America in that moment when you found out about Orlando?
It's interesting because when I woke up, my wife and I have twin 7-year-olds, and when I woke up that morning, I actually didn't put on the news and I didn't look at my phone. I've been trying to detach a little from tech on the weekends and focus on my family, and so my phone rang and it was our head of comms, and he was briefing me on what happened. And as I was being briefed, I was looking at my kids because we were in the kitchen and it was breakfast, and I thought, my first thought was, I thought we fixed this at a level. I didn't think that they would have to experience this or live through a crisis of this proportion. Now, saying that, I know that the LGBT community, as reported by the FBI, is the minority group that has the most hate crimes or violence, against it. So, that doesn't exactly line up. But when you're looking at your kids and you're thinking about it, you're thinking about that next generation. The work that I do is really about the next generation and trying to make the world a better place and accelerate acceptance in this country. So it really was, for me, it was devastating, as for most of us, but immediately turned into determination. And that, as our role, with my role at GLAAD, immediately it was about getting down there and knowing that a media village was going to be setting up, if not already set up, and making sure that the right message was getting out there about how this was targeting LGBTQ people and that this was a direct hit on our community. So it was very emotional.
I was in utter shock when I saw the news. I'm going to get a little teary because I was out with my friends the night it happened. I was at a club that was very similar to the club that was targeted. I was with people that looked just like me, so very Latino heavy and diverse. There was a lot of diversity there. And so when I started hearing the reports come through, all of those feelings and emotions of immediately being like, oh my goodness, it could have been me or any one of the people in my community that it happened to really struck home. And as the reports came through, you start hearing about people who are connected to people who are victims, and it's not so far away. It's 2 removed. It's 1 removed, and it's just heartbreaking. And for it to happen during Pride season was equally devastating to me personally, because Pride is a very emotional time of year for me personally. Being a gay man in Texas, a gay Latino in Texas growing up, I fought a lot with my own self-identity and my own self-acceptance. And it wasn't until I moved to San Francisco as a 24-year-old and experienced my first San Francisco Pride that I realized that there's this entire beautiful world out there that you can find acceptance of who you are and your own inner beauty and your own outer beauty, that you didn't realize you had all this power available to yourself. So all of that, I think, really made it super emotional. And my fiance had a coworker who lost friends in that event. So immediately, again, there was a charge to action, and we felt like very responsible to our own community to make things happen. I was planning a Pride event for a queer tech meetup later that week. It was immediately a catalyst to pull together a lot of the other organizations in the space and make sure that the messaging was, again, cohesive, and that we were all coming together as one community, which was powerful and very emotional. So that whole, I'm still reeling from a lot of those emotions personally.
For me, it wasn't until the next day. I had woken up and had plans for the day, and earlier that week, I think, had attended a wonderful White House, the last Obama White House LGBT reception, which was wonderful and heartbreaking at the same time. But to wake up, and I got a text from a friend that said, "Did you see what happened?" And this is at like 9 a.m. and on a Saturday, and I'm like, "No, it's, I didn't." And then I saw the news, and I went on Twitter and to see what was happening, and I felt so detached from it. Like almost as if I had put blinders on and just made myself really distant. Because as somebody who writes about social justice, injustices that have been occurring across this country for the past couple of years, sometimes I feel like I have to take a minute because it becomes so personal when you start listing off all of the young Black men, women, and children that are being shot at what seems like on a daily basis, when we were just in the month of the year anniversary of the shooting at Mother Emanuel that was devastating, and we didn't even have a moment to take pause and kind of remember that before then Orlando, and then the headlines of the biggest mass shooting, and I'm thinking to myself, when are we gonna stop having that? So it was the next day that I was sitting on the couch and I'm going through feeds and I'm listening to the news, and I just burst into tears because it had occurred to me much in the same way, Andy, that I'm like, these could have been all of my friends. It's Pride. Everybody is out. Even the people who, like myself, don't ever find themselves out because I'm old and married. Are out now. It's Pride. You're out and you're celebrating and you're hanging out. And so the idea that this could have been in Washington, D.C., where I live, and it could have been a club that I frequent, during the celebratory time, was just astounding to me. And I know that you're going to get into this, but what was even more so, as the sadness starts to set in, then the anger for me quickly follows that, because it then became a very politicized moment where you had people talking on one side about, how could this happen? If we had these protections in place, if we had these safety laws in place, none of these things, would be happening. And then on the other side, you had LGBT people being taken out of their own story and just kind of lumped into, and not understanding that this was a targeted attack against the LGBTQ community, and against the Latino community, not just a random attack or a lone wolf incident, which is what I feel like the media constantly tries to feed us, is that, don't worry, it's just this lone wolf thing. It's like, no, it's actually a system that has been designed to oppress a group of people that then gave license to someone to think that they could go into a place of joy and eliminate us. And so that, to me, is a much deeper conversation than what we want to segue to, which is lone wolf, don't worry, it's, person with these certain ties to these certain groups, instead of examining the kind of culture of homophobia and transphobia and racism that we breed here in the United States every day. We want to like look elsewhere. So for me, it went from sadness to anger very quickly.
How many of you here work at companies, sort of over 100 people? Raise your hand. Just trying to get a sense of. So I like to have open discussions. If there's a point that you guys have a really sort of urgent question or even a comment about things that have happened in your companies, part of the thing I'm actually curious for you is how this impacted your company culturally, right? This is a tech conference. Most of this is around diversity and inclusion within the corporate context. And so if there are things that came up during this moment, I mean, this was obviously a really powerful moment in history around intersectionality and some of the things we all work on from a day to day. But I think in a way that we haven't really thought about in terms of gun violence and gun violence prevention. Sarah, I'm interested sort of what Danielle was talking around language and sort of, especially around sort of what companies can do to make sure certain language and certain communities are uplifted in these moments, right? A lot of the work you do is sort of around empowering communities when these tragedies happen. I think that could be, really important in terms of context for what companies could take back in these moments.
Sure. I think one of the easiest things to do is acknowledge what happened to your staffs and your teams and let them know that it's important to you and that it matters. And choosing the right language around that is really important because, as Danielle was saying, that eliminating the fact that it was an LGBTQ attack. One of the things that I like to say is that in America, this guy could have walked into any bar, but he didn't. He walked into a Latino night at an LGBTQ bar. And so acknowledging that is really, really important. And then in addition to that, offering any sort of resources. And a lot of companies don't even know that they have the resources, but you do have employee assistant programs in place. And they're kind of, a lot of times, even smaller businesses, as part of your human resources packages, it's tucked in there too. And that's where somebody can talk to somebody about it, because people still, we live in bubbles oftentimes in New York, San Francisco, and Los Angeles. But especially if you have employees throughout this country, it's really important that you're offering them resources that they can talk to privately, because they might live in a very different environment and culture than we live in New York, LA, and San Francisco, and some of the other metropolitan cities of America. But so I think that's really important, acknowledging it, sending a note to the employees, and then giving them an opportunity to talk to somebody that is either a grief counselor. This has been a huge impact to the LGBT community. And, even at GLAD, what I was trying to do was phone back. I convened everybody by phone because I was down there. And so, and then when I got back, I convened everybody. And what's different for us is that we didn't have time to mourn anything. We had to, this is when we're called to be leaders and act. And so one of the, the biggest mass shooting in America happens, and we have to respond and react to it. We don't have time to grieve or count or console each other so much. And so it's really important, I think, that we take a moment around that and empower, if you do have any sort of LGBT ERG or BRG groups, to ask the leaders of those groups how you can help, and see what ways you can help them.
I think a really important piece as well of bringing people together that you work with, which is really important, is also having conversations with your family and friends. Like, this is about, ways that we can combat racism and homophobia and hate just in general, and it doesn't happen in a vacuum. And I think that what we recognize from incidences like Orlando and like Mother Emanuel and like Newtown and all of these kind of different, situations, is that it takes all of us talking to each other and having real open conversations about these issues, and not just when it happens, but like on a continual basis. You know, I think I was working with an organization that they had only had like one cultural competency training like ever, right? And I think to myself, oh my God, you have new people that you hire and that, you know, come in, interns, fellows every year, and you're only doing one a year and just like kind of checking it off your list. Cultural competency is kind of like working out. You need to do it all the time, right? Like it's not just the one workshop that lasts half a day and then everybody pats themselves on the back and says, great, we're all inclusive. You know, let's go on to the next thing. It's really important to flex that muscle, and you only do that through really authentic, real conversations, and some of which are led by facilitators as opposed to having them be led and have people in an organization feel like they have to be the ambassador for their lone group, because that often also becomes the issue, right? I've worked in places where I am the only African American person and possibly the only out LGBT person that's there. So now all of a sudden I have become the UN ambassador for now both of these groups that I am constantly asked for, you know, to stand. Danielle, can you speak to us about this? Yeah, I could, but then you're also making me, you know, the spotlight candidate for that, as opposed to having be an open conversation, right? And it's not only the responsibility of the person that looks different than everybody in the room to have that conversation about what how these phobias feel, right? It actually makes a lot of sense for it to come as a collective.
I think that's totally so important to say and to really think about. So often in the diversity space, you know, there's these sort of silos. It's the LGBTQ luncheon, it's the women's luncheon, it's the person of color luncheon, it's the Black Latino luncheon, and so many times we miss this opportunity to come together. An example I'll tell you about, I helped produce a LGBTQ Tech and Innovation Summit at the White House, and one of the things I really stress to them is that we can't just focus on marriage and HIV/AIDS, which oftentimes when you think about queer issues, it's the two things that come up. And, you know, as a lesbian, HIV/AIDS, you know, generally doesn't affect my community as much, right? It's sort of more in this country not been there. Marriage, if you're not considering that, right? We're LGBTQ people we're Americans, and all of these issues affect us. And so what we did, you know, we focused on health, we focused on, you know, general topics that impact all of us. And that was a really important switch for people. And I see it all the time at companies. They have internal resources dedicated to these areas of focus. And oftentimes they even have them at the same moment. They'll have a lunch that covers all the different areas, and you actually have to choose. You have to say, am I gonna go to the LGBTQ one? Am I gonna go to the Black one? Am I gonna go to the women's focused one? Like, and if you have multiple identities, you know how it's a really hard choice. And I think it can be, you know, sometimes it's social and it's networking, but other times it's you know, topics that we're talking about today. So I'm curious, I'm gonna switch it up and ask the group a question. Has there been anything within your companies or, you know, community around Orlando that you've tried that's worked and sort of brought an interesting perspective or dialogue to the table?
I don't have a company, but I'm a fellow in public media, and one of the things that have come up in our groups is suddenly, I mean, America's at this unique threshold where maybe we can really lens into inclusivity via this idea that we're all equally killable. So whether you go to a gurdwara, or whether you are trans, or whether you are a young child in grade 3, you are equally killable. We are equally expendable now in this lens. So I think it would be very interesting for media makers to start discussing just this fact that we can be annihilated pretty easily, and we are being annihilated pretty easily. Is that weird? I mean, is that a weird way to come together?
This one's louder.
No, I was going to say I don't think that that's weird at all. I think that that's actually something. Unfortunately, I feel like we're living in a time where fear is uniting us more than anything else, right? Like we had our arch of hope. I'd like to believe that it's still there, but it's buried real deep, deep, deep down. And so we're united around the idea of fear, right? This idea that, there are people that said around Orlando, well, why were they out at that time of night? Okay, well, why were the people in Colorado like at a movie theater? Why were kids at school? Like that, it has become such an increasingly ridiculous thing to blame a victim. Right. So I think that there is an ability. We do have an ability, and I think the media has a responsibility to educate and to unite people and have real conversations and ask really hard questions. I was very impressed around Orlando with Anderson Cooper for the first time in a really long time, that he kept hammering the Attorney General in Florida about the way she had voted over the course of of time, of not allowing gay couples to adopt, and didn't you vote against this, and didn't you vote against this? And she's like, Anderson, this is not what we're here about. We're here about the people of Orlando. And I'm saying, and he just kept going at her, and then to finally get her to say, yeah, maybe yeah, okay, maybe. It does have some. And I said, so if the media doesn't connect the dots for us, right, then they allow people to come up with a lot of just other ideas, like blaming the victim. When you say, wait a minute, where does hate come from? Why are certain groups targeted more so than other groups, right? Like, who has the microphone and the platform, and what are they spreading? And how does that sow the seeds of domestic terrorism that takes on all different kinds of forms? It doesn't always come, with a gun. It comes in other ways, like by not hiring people, right? Like by creating educational barriers, by creating, situational poverty. Like all of these different things occur. And so I think it's important, as you're a media fellow, that the media does begin to do that. And it was exciting for me to see that moment of Anderson doing just that, like keep going at it, to let the viewers know, wait a minute, we should be holding people responsible for the level of the rhetoric and the hatred that is becoming so much part of our norm these days.
I'll add to that to counterbalance that, the Lieutenant Governor of Utah, I don't know if a lot of you saw his speech, which was a really powerful speech. And one of the great things that he did in that speech, because he, like the Attorney General of Florida, had voted against and was anti-LGBTQ. But what he did was he acknowledged and apologized for adding, as he said, to the hate in this country. And I think that kind of light bulb in a politician's head, and it being someone that is very relatable to other people who might have had his former opinions. I saw it transform people. They told me it did. And I think that that's really powerful. And I saw a lot more of that, where there were these opportunities and a platform for people who had added, this year, there have been over 100 anti-LGBT bills that have been put forth, right? Most of them we've fought and won against, and some have gotten through. Well, we're expecting that the next cycle is going to be even worse. They're going to be more organized, and that adds to this culture of hate. And as you legislate hate, it fills into the culture, and it turns into what we see happen to the LGBTQ community every day, violence. And so having politicians own where they've gone wrong and course correct is really powerful. And using media to shine a light on that is really, really powerful.
And beyond media, we've seen obviously leaders like Mark Benioff, tech leaders, step into this conversation around things like Indiana, North Carolina in a huge way. What can they do? What can they push for? Are there things even on the policy side around gun violence prevention? Is this sort of, what is this going to catalyze in terms of the urgency, and what can tech leaders do to push this beyond obviously the media part of this?
Well, I think they actually have a voice, a progressive voice in the community right now, and a lot of people look to the tech companies to be the leaders of innovation. And so part of that innovation is also social innovation and making sure that they are appearing on the right side of history. And we've seen a lot of pushback when CEOs are not the most innovative in their thinking, even if it's years ago, and they end up losing their position. So I really feel like they do hold real positions of power to make changes. And as you've mentioned, Mark Benioff and other CEOs taking a stand in North Carolina, I think it's a great way to leverage their economic power to see real change in the world.
I just want to, Mark did an amazing interview on CNN that I urge everyone to Google and view, where he talked about that CEOs, because of their roles, CEOs typically were all about the bottom line. And as the world has evolved, his point is that and CEOs are in various countries, they are in various cultures, that they have more of a social obligation than ever before, and that they have to use their platform more than just for the bottom line. And we all know, I think in this room, and that's why we're having this conversation, there's a bazillion white papers, right, out there that says diversity and inclusion drive better bottom lines. And so there is that. Also, it always goes down to the bottom line, but I think that the way he talks about using your platform as a CEO for social change and how it should be a job requirement and not a nice to do, but a have to do, is really powerful.
Yeah, and I agree. I think that I believe that all CEOs have a responsibility, but especially tech CEOs, because they have branded themselves in a way that innovation is what they do, right? And innovation can't just be about app development and about making. Innovation is about making people's lives better, right? Making the world better, and that involves social innovation. And what does that look like? What does that mean? I recently was looking at a couple of different sites just to see, what their job placements look like, right? What their ads look like. And there was one site I was blown away, where on the application it said preferred pronoun. And I had never seen that before, anywhere. And everybody always says, "Oh, we're equal opportunity."
What company was it?
Huh? Vox Media, which I thought was just incredibly impressive, because most companies have the little line that says we're equal opportunity employers, da 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 da, race, sexual orientation, gender. But I said, just to go just a little bit deeper to say, what pronouns do you prefer, and then list them out. So that they have a better picture of who's coming in and the kind of people that they want to bring into their organizations. I think that matters. But I think that it's important to take a stand and to use your platforms. And I love the fact that we live in a culture and age right now where social media holds people accountable for their silence. And I see it everywhere, where you see pictures and signs that say silence equals violence, and I absolutely agree with that. We're not living in a time right now where you can sit comfortably on the sidelines and watch all of this happen. It's just not okay, and it's not acceptable. And so if you have your headquarters are in North Carolina, or they're in Indiana, or they're in these places that are low equality places, then you have to be accountable to the laws that are there, right? And to what kind of environment you're creating for your workers that you're hiring, right? And just by sitting in that space and saying nothing, then you are agreeing with the policies that are on the book, and we need to hold people accountable for their silence.
I love that point, silence equals violence, and I think it permeates even to a personal level. And the conversations that are happening after Orlando on a relationship level are astonishing me, and I think that is one of the biggest surprises that I've seen come out of the incident, is friends that I thought were completely out to their families actually coming fully out and embracing their true selves. And you know, these are guys that I've known for years, and we talk about their family, their moms come to visit, their families come to visit, but they've never really embraced all of themselves. Even my family, like my mom is very, like I'm getting married in November, and my mom is still hesitant. And I've been with my fiance for 6+ years, and she still kind of treads the water lightly when it comes to our relationship because it's not something she knows. She was one of the first people that called me on Sunday, and it hit her. She was like, oh my gosh, that could have been you. You talked about the Latino nights at the clubs all the time and how they were your favorite, and it like triggered something visceral in her and brought it to this entire new level of, oh, this is real. And even my father, who is a gun-toting Texan, you know, had a moment where he, on Father's Day, said, I'm sorry. And it was groundbreaking and changing to hear that.
I think internalized homophobia, we forget how relevant it is. Often, I work a lot with companies around, obviously, LGBT women specifically, but often they sort of, say, we usually wait for a leader to come to us and say, we want to participate. And my response to them is, it's interesting. What if you sent it out first and allowed people to know that you supported this? And a lot of companies have gone that route, and the participation is usually obviously much higher because people are still uncomfortable. We do summits in San Francisco and New York, and in New York, actually, I was so surprised by how many people were not comfortable bringing their sort of professional and personal identity together at a professional conference. And I think, these moments obviously highlight really extreme things that we need to work on, but they also sort of, I think, urge us to push forward in the areas that we can focus on every day, which is having these conversations at work and our personal life. I want to open it up to questions. I still have a couple for the panel, but yep.
Hello, I really enjoyed this panel. I am a woman, I identify as straight, but the interesting thing is I went to college with Danielle's wife, Aisha, and I'm just talking to Aisha. So that's very cool, like University of Maryland, stand up. But the deeper issue for me is I have a lot of friends who are gay, et cetera. And at the end of the day, gay, straight, otherwise, several of my gay and straight friends lost a friend in the Orlando massacre. So it comes down to just humanness, which I need people to get back to. It's like start loving, because it could be you, and it could be somebody in your family, and all this judgment, I'm over it. I love being black. You identify as gay, straight, or other. I really don't care. You're a human being, and we gotta get back to humanness. Thank you.
Other questions? Yeah.
Was there conversation in your place of employment? And I was kind of struck by that because I realized the silence that actually took place. I'm in education, the education field, and I'm a tech and education entrepreneur. And I just was looking even on my employer's website, and there was nothing that mentioned. And just the silence. And there's so many of us who work in communities that have gay, lesbian, bisexual, transgender folk, and how there was such a deafening silence. My colleagues and I, we have a very close cohort, and at least 2 of the people, my cohort, the 8 of us, identify as being lesbian, and the fact that there was not a whole lot of conversation about it, and which I think there was a numbness because there's been so many killings, so much gun violence, and it's just been really horrible. But when you ask that question, it really struck a chord because we haven't talked about it at all. I mean, at all. And it's something that I want to bring back to my employers, that, we haven't addressed this. Even the president of the college, he didn't write an article about it. He didn't, stand up about it. And so I just thank you for even posing that question, because it just did not even resonate with me until you asked.
I think that the reason why all of these phobias continue to exist and grow is because of silence, is because of the silence, meaning that we don't value you and we don't see you. And so we're not going to talk about you. That's what breeds this sickness. I wrote about homophobia and racism being a form of domestic terrorism, and got hella backlash about it. And, because I was being honest and saying that, no, we're going to call this what this is. Because when you don't name it, it persists, right? So we're going to call acts of terror, which are meant to terrify particular groups, exactly what they are, which is domestic terrorism. And I think that when we don't have conversations about it, whether it's in your family, at your job, at your gym, or wherever, if we're not talking about it, then we're feeding, that silence is feeding that phobia.
I also think what's really important with both of these women's comments is that when you look at the younger generation, the Gen Zers in this world, the 13 to 20-year-olds, and especially you all are at companies that are going to want to start courting them and putting them in your pipeline, and you look what's interesting to them and where they are in their headspace, they're very outspoken about how they feel, and they don't see necessarily the same things that I'm probably a little bit older than this group in here, but the identities that we all have and hold, they just see people, like this woman was talking about being human, and they see multiple identities against everybody, and they see everybody as someone who's layered and complex and not simplistic, and you can't put them in a box, and you can't just check that on an employee status or an employment application. And so in order to start recruiting these guys and making them interested in you, you're going to have to speak up. Your company's going to have to say something. They're going to expect to hear something. And they're also going to expect things like, I'm really impressed with the pronoun choices on that application. They're going to expect, and they'll fill it in if they don't see it. And the more I study about them, because we're doing quite a bit of work at GLAAD with them, is they do it in a really in a really profound and interesting way where it's part of their everyday. This isn't like, they don't need a meeting once a week or every month. This is what they do every day, and it's ingrained in them.
And I'd have to say that those siloed meetings too, side note,
Yeah.
Are part of the problem. I think it's part of the inclusion actually is supposed to mean that everyone is included. I recognize that it is necessary to have safe spaces where, African American employee group and, Latino employee group and LGBTQ and all of these different things. But I think it's incredibly important if you're talking about inclusion and you're talking about ways to combat silence and all of these things, to make that a part of the culture and climate of the organization and company, so that you don't need to have separate groups, right? Because everybody is allowed to show up as who they are, where they are.
Or just having spaces where they can come together, and it's on a different topic than the community part of it, because I do think we just end up talking in the same circles. I mean, I can't tell you how many events I've been to where it's just, I see we all sort of separate out, and I'm like, no, it's like, our group's mostly focused on LGBT women. I actually want to talk to the straight ally women and tell them about our story, and I can't because they're on the women's group and we're just with the lesbians and the queer women. So I see those moments or missed opportunities often for bringing these other conversations. My last question is sort of, I think the LGBTQ movement has done amazing work in the last decade, especially around things like marriage. And do you think there's a space, especially around, I was reading some stats on hate crimes, and the FBI put out a report that in 2014, in general, everything dropped a little bit besides anti-Muslim hate crimes. So do you think there's a space for the LGBTQ movement to sort of take on some of these other areas as we sort of think about hate in this country?
I just want to make one comment about the anti-Muslim thing you said. The one thing that I was profoundly aware of, and I think that a lot of the leaders in the LGBT movement were, is that when we assembled every day on the phone as soon as Orlando started or happened. And one of the first press releases that we released together, I can't tell you how many organizations, it was well over 40, were on it that said that we are not targeting the Muslims and that we do not want this to turn now on the Muslim community, and really banded together around that. We don't want to be pitted against each other. And I think that's really speaks to the inclusion. Like, we're all in this together, and we know that when we're together, we're stronger and we're better together. And so I do think that when you talk about intersectionality, and if people know what that means, it just means the multiple identities that you have. You might be lesbian and black, and you can have many identities. We all do. That's what is unique about the LGBT community, because we come in every shape, size, color, flavor, and we are everywhere. And so I think that is a unifying particular trait of the community that's unique to this community.
I also think that we need to leverage the power of our smaller communities in the smaller cities across the United States, because they are, having come from a community that is completely, there weren't enough Latin bear identifying individuals to fill a club like there is here in New York. But in those smaller communities, you intermix with everybody who identifies as queer. It's not the LGBT, it's just queer. It's just, I'm different and I'm expressing myself how I express myself, and you interact with every walk of life. And that's how I was brought up in the gay culture. And I really think that is a power that we have over other communities, because we don't look at people as different. We try to figure out how to include them in our common fight or goal as a community as a whole. So I think we do have that power available to us.
I think, too, to answer your question, we need to have more conversations, and I can't stress that enough, so I'll just keep saying it until I'm blue in the face, because what happens is, because we're human beings, we wait until tragedy to occur, and then we have a conversation about it. Everybody kind of feels a little bit better, and then we move on until the next tragedy happens. Just as much as the LGBTQ community wants other groups to stand with them in tragedy, I also have had many conversations with LGBT organizations for their silence around Black Lives Matter, for their silence around things that occur to communities that are not expressly LGBTQ. And to the point that Sarah Kate made, I have said this many times, that the LGBT community is one community that intersects with all other communities. And so when you're not having conversations about Black Lives Matter, and you're not having conversations where you understand that there are LGBT Muslims, right, where we're allowing divisive groups to come in and pin one against the other because they assume that all LGBTQ people are white, or Christian, or men, it's very frustrating to me. But in the same way, regardless of where you stand, when tragedy happens, it's your responsibility as a human being to engage, right? It's your responsibility, because what kind of world do you want to live in? What kind of world do you want to work in, tech or otherwise? And it's not one where when you sit silent, and I never remember the quote, but when they come for you and they come for your neighbor across the street and they come for the person down the street and you say nothing, then they come around and they come for you, and there's no one left to stand with you. And so I think as a movement, as a member of the LGBT community, as an advocate, it's really important that we don't just wait to speak out about the importance of inclusion when something bad happens to us, right? Because something bad happens to some group every day and every way. are targeted by hate and bias. And it's important for us to continue to have like these conversations that exist outside of siloed tragedy and start to exist on a very real human reason, very human space. And I think that, too, the last thing that I'll say is that, you know, you brought this up in the front, that like, you know, we're living in this really like interesting time, and I would say we're living in a very dangerous time. We're living in a very dangerous time where certain rhetoric is rising up without fact, without any merit, without, you know, any rhyme or reason. And it's allowed to take over because everybody else is just sitting silent. Everybody else thinks it's a joke. Everybody else thinks that it'll go away until, you know, until it doesn't, right? And so I think that it's really important for us to engage with one another and recognize the power that we all have, whether you are a CEO or not, the power that you have to affect change.
I think we have to wrap up. The last question I'll just pose to you, I didn't get into this topic, but thinking about gun violence prevention and the movement behind gun violence prevention, I think this has been an interesting wake-up call for the LGBTQ community specifically, right? Because this has been sort of a call to get involved with a bigger movement. But what if we sort of add gun violence prevention to the diversity inclusion space, like just as a thought in terms of how companies can participate, how people can participate? When you get a chance to cover it, it could probably be its own panel, but something to think about.
Yes, great. Well, thank you. Thank you all.